آقای دکتر زنگنه در حال حاضر اسیستان پروفسور در دپارتمان سایکولوژی منطقی هستن. لیسانسشون رو در دانشگاه BBC انجام دادن، دکتراشون رو در دانشگاه منطقی و بعد از پستاک شدن.
No, that's not. I'm like that. خیلی ممنون که وقتتون رو داشتید. من برای اینکه طبق روال گذشته بتونم این کار رو صحبت رو ادامه بدم، قرار بود که برنامه به زبان انگلیسی باشه و من میتونم کمتر خواهد بود، احتمالا حوصلت من کمتر سر خواهد. فقط خواستم گوشت کنم که به نظر میاد این مشکل تکنیکی داره که من نمیتونم حلش کنم و اینکه رنگ نسیه پریده از پروژکت داره و حالا ممکنه یک ایرادی رو در موقع دیدن فیلم هم ایجاد کنیم که نسیه باید برصورت میریم سر اصل مطلب. یه خلاصه کوتاه خدمت من فکر می‌کنم صورتتون برام آشناست، فکر می‌کنم جلسات قبل اومده بودید یا دیدید جایی یا شنیدید، ولی یه قرار یه سلسله برصورت گفت و شنیدی باشه برای در رابطه با این تاپیکی که من انتخاب کردم. فعلا رسیدیم به قسمت سومش. فکر می‌کنم یک یا دو قسمت دیگه‌اش بمونه برای ماه‌های آینده و برای اینکه یه قدری هم در واقع یه بک‌گراندی بهتون داده باشم، قراره که چند تا اسلایدی از صحبت گذشته رو خلاصه‌اش رو بهتون اینجا مطرح کنم. در صورت من حالا عوض می‌کنم. So, this is the plan for tonight. Very simple structure. As I said, I'll start with a few slides on the last couple of sessions. Then we delve into a very interesting, very current topic that deals with a brain mechanism recently discovered for social learning. That seems to be something, in the most part, unique in something that has evolved in possibly the past 100 million years or so, but more so during the evolution of the human species as opposed to the great apes. Mind you, there are various lines of evidence suggesting that, again, this is not something that just came out of the blue, just randomly occurred in the human development and evolution, but rather something that was built upon based on a former, more rudimentary blueprint. So we'll get to talk a little bit about the animal literature and work on this topic. And, sorry, and then what is the topic of the next couple of segments of the documentary that is basically forming the background or the essence of this talk series. It's going to be looking at different learning strategies in the context of social learning and how we can make a distinction between imitation versus emulation. And in that context, when we take a look at the human condition and we can compare it to these great apes and see whether we learn things the same way, and if not, how do we differ, and what would be perhaps a point of divergence in our cognitive evolution so far. So, going back to the basics, I started the whole series based on already known facts about how we've come to be as an organism. We consider the human body to be the result of millions of years of a very slow process called evolution, and the discoverer of the principles, not of the concept really, but of the principles of how evolution takes place. Is well known to everybody. It's Charles Darwin, who's lived about 150 years ago, and since then he's basically stumbled upon possibly one of the most profound discoveries in science. Some people even consider his contribution to science even greater than what Einstein and some other luminaries have done. So, in that sense, I don't want to revere Darwin here, but in essence, what the larger scientific community believes is that you take any part of the body. We're looking here at the human limb, for example. We can find similarities between the limbs of other creatures and that of the human body. And through the process of comparative anatomy and going through fossil records and looking at genetics and so on and so forth, we can say that ultimately each one of these arms or limbs is the result of a slow process of evolution in its proper context for that particular species, so that that individual or that organism can do two things. First is to increase its chances of survival, where those changes have conferred upon that organism the chance to have a longer life. And in that process, then that individual has, or that organism has the chance to pass on those genes that govern the development of the limb to that shape, or that shape, or that shape, to its offspring. So, in that sense, the instructions to build a limb get passed on to the next generation, and so on and so forth. And here we are, 4.5 billion years after the first life forms appeared on Earth, standing here with her sort of layout and these body parts. So if that is the case, that's basically the premise upon which the whole discussion of cognitive evolution has been centered. So the idea is that if that is what's happening to the entire body, then the brain is not excluded from that process. And as a result, we can tell somewhat of a similar story about brain evolution. And I'm very sorry about what's happening here, because I can see that you can't see a lot of the things that are on my screen. So, maybe we just skip the screen. I'll turn this around and we look at the sure. You know what? It's just if you guys don't mind coming a little closer so you can see what's here. So basically the idea is the following. That the brain is considered to be the hardware upon which the mind sort of operates. The mind needs this hardware to do its various functions. And that organ itself has undergone a tremendous amount of evolution, has changed from a tiny little sort of nut shape or nut sized organ in the skull of a reptile, all the way to what you and I carry as this 3-pound mass of this sort of amorphous substance that is by far the largest, well, if you exclude the skin and the liver, is the largest organ in the body. And in fact, it's the largest per cubic centimeter of body size. It's the largest organ that anybody carries around as far as the nervous system is concerned. Anybody by that means amongst all animals of the animal kingdom. So then the argument sort of goes further and it says that if the brain has undergone evolution, if the brain has changed over time, so must the mind that is carried, if you will, by the brain, or the mind that revolves sort of around the brain's structure and function for its operation. In fact, even within our closest relatives, we can see that the brain, there has been an evolutionary push, if you will, or force to try to maximize the size of the brain that fits in the primate skull. In the past 10 or so millions of years, we can see there has been a massive expansion in the size of the cavity, the skull cavity, so that the brain could take on more and more of that space. And as a result, not only it's taken up a lot more volume per se, but its surface has also increased tremendously by taking on more and more folds that we call the gyro or gyration pattern of the brain to maximize the surface per volume that you would sort of jam into the skull. So essentially, where we stand right now is in a place where we have a rather profound understanding of what the brain does in terms of what neuroscientists refer to as localization of function. Exactly which part of the brain is carrying out what function. This was a complete mystery towards the end of the 19th century. One of the first people who managed to pinpoint a particular brain structure that had something important to do was Paul Broca. And by studying people who had difficulty producing speech after they had some strokes, particular parts of their brain, he managed to define an area of the brain that we now call the Broca's area, somewhere down here where you hopefully will see later on, referred to as the speech area. And then since then, there has been, as I said, a tremendous amount of effort in both the field of anatomy, or neuroanatomy, in the field of cognitive neuroscience, and basic neuroscience, to try to understand what every part of this brain that we look at is doing. And that is, what you're looking at here is the result of many of these studies compiled together to give you sort of a clear picture as to where some of these basic functions are being carried out. So, for example, when we look at the back of the brain, the furthest point from your eyes, we have the primary visual areas. That's where the visual information goes first before it gets distributed to most of the brain. And the brain turns out to be predominantly driven by visual information. When you look at this part, which is sort of hidden under your neck, the cerebellum, that's the part that is taking care of your posture control and the automation of movements such as walking, and so on and so forth. You're looking at the sides of the brain. Yes. شما را هم ترجمه سوال انجام
واسه شما گفتیم که مثلا واسه صحبت کردن یا برای دیدن جاهای مختلف مغز دارن فعال میشن. اما سوال اینجا مطرح میشه، مثلا ما داریم بدن میزنیم، یه سگی به ما پارس میکنه. خب چشم داره میشنوه، ناحیه مخصوصی عقل مغز فعال میشه، گوش داره میشنوه. خب منطقه تجربیاتی که ما از قبل داشتیم که آقا وقتی سگ داره پارس میکنه باید بمونی، نه باید بترسی. یا آنالیز اینجا داره انجام میشه. یا واسه صحبت کردن ما فکر میکنیم چه ادبیاتی استفاده بکنیم، چه کلماتی استفاده بکنیم، بعد خروجی اون تفکر ما میاد اون مرحله، اون نقطه از مغز فعال میکنه. حالا اینو من نمیدونم آیا این کشف کردن دانشمندان که این لول‌های، چون توضیح میدن مغز 4 تا لوب داره که این لوب‌های مختلف با هم در ارتباطن. حالا این لول‌های مختلف مغز چجوری با هم دیگه کار میکنن که خروجی مثلا واسه اسپیچ مثلا میشه اون نقطه. در واقع اون نقطه‌ای که داره فعال میشه خروجی تفکرات ماه.
تا یه حدی درسته. تا اونجایی که به رفتار اتوماتیک ربط نداشته باشه، یعنی از در واقع از تفکر تجربیاتمون به صورت کانشسلی داریم استفاده میکنیم. بله اون حرف شما درسته، ولی خیلی حرکاتمون هم بدون دخالت آگاهی داره انجام میشه، مثلا حرکت نفس کشیدن یا وقتی که شما را شروع میکنید به راه رفتن دیگه فکر نمیکنید که الان قدم چپ رو باید بردارم چون قبلا راست رو برداشتم یا اینکه باید دوباره راست رو بردارم، چون میدونید یه سری چیزها از اون ذهن آگاه در میاد برای اینکه بارش رو کمتر بکنه، میره مثلا دلیگیت میشه، منتقل میشه به یه جایی مثل سربلاد، اون دیگه اتوماتیکلی اینا رو داره انجام میده. نمیدونم جواب سوال شما رو
این چیزی که اگر موقع من چیزی که اتوماتیک بار داره انجام داده میشه، بله مثلا شما دیگه
اینا که دارم صحبتشو میکنم اینا همه کورتکسه. آره فرونتال لوب از این نمیدونم چقدر از اینجا رو میبینین یا نه، از این خط مرزی اینجا به این جلو رو ما میگیم فرونتال لوب. در واقع تقریبا توی انسان میشه نصف مغز، نصف اون سطح قشر خاکستری مغز. اینجاست که بیشتر این در واقع اینتگریشن ها داره صورت میگیره که شما بتونید از مموری، از شنوایی، از بینایی اینا رو همه رو با هم یه جوری جمع جور بکنید که یک همه اینا یه داستان رو بگم. بعد شما بتونید فهمانه‌های لازم رو برای حرکت‌های مناسب نسبت به اون چیزی که بیرون از خودتون هست صادر بکنید و خب بعداً هم ماسل ها فرمانبر مغز هم عملاً اگه آدم یاد گرفته باشه درست چه کار بکنه اون کارشون رو انجام میدن، اونا دیگه به صورت اتوماتیک کارشون رو انجام میدن. برای زمینه سازی صحبت و اینجا صحبت کنم. در صورت حالا علتی چی میگفت؟ بزنید ببینید که مثلا مهم میشه. So we're saying, yeah, so these different labels you see are, again, the result of these really long mapping exercises, either by studying normal brains or brains that have undergone some damage, in the case of stroke patients or tumor patients or people who had accidents, sustained damage to their heads, to their skulls, and ultimately to their brains, and lost certain kinds of capacities. So for example, if somebody has, as I said earlier, somebody has a stroke that kills the neural tissue over here, then people, even though they can think in linguistic terms, they can understand language, they can even write language, and you know, they can write stuff, they won't be able to produce speech as well as they could before, or they could, in very severe cases, they cannot utter a single word, as simple as that. People who have damage to this part of the brain end up having, there's a very distinct location down here called the fusiform face area. You don't need to know the names, but there's a face area in the brain that presumably takes all the visual information that pertains to faces and processes them there. So there's a highly specialized area within the context of visual brain that deals only with faces. And people who have damage to that part have various sort of levels of difficulty recognizing familiar faces, to the point that at the extreme end, they won't even recognize photographs of themselves. You show them a photograph, they know it's a face, but they can't tell you who it is. So the compilation of all these kinds of studies tell us important things about the brain, and that that each distinct part seems to be carrying out a very distinct function. So now put this in the context of what we've been saying so far. This organ has undergone a tremendous amount of change over the course of the evolution, just like other body parts. And it seems that there seems to have been a particular pressure to increase the capacity of the brain so that it can do possibly more things than the lower creatures could And now we have the functions that go along with different parts. So the logical conclusion to draw from this is that each of these functions must exist or must have been there in some form or shape in these lower creatures that are related to us. That what we benefit from today is not the result of some magic formula that created the human condition, but the result of these millions and millions of years of very slow, gradual progress to get us to where we are. Now, it's a very fine idea, but it's also very controversial, because then on the other side of it, you have people who argue in non-scientific ways about other strategies that the human condition may have come about. And I'm not here to argue for or against any particular point of view. I'm just trying to sort of relate to you, my audience, where the science stands and what science has been able to provide to us as evidence in support of this notion that we are not, let me rephrase that we are the result of, again, this long process of gradual change. If that is the case, then let's go back and use scientific methodologies to try to find exactly what we share with our common ancestors or related species, and what is truly and uniquely human, what is ours, what is shared amongst us. And that is really what the premise of cognitive evolution is. Again, the mind is assumed to be made up of a collection of modules, just like you can think of it as pieces of a puzzle that you have to put together to form an entire sort of image or picture, or pieces of Lego that you have to assemble to create a structure. Each module is specialized to carry out a very specific function, such as the ones you saw earlier. And that the function of each of these modules is the result of this adaptive process that confers an advantage to the organism possessing it. So let's say if bats are so good at hearing the smallest changes in frequency and amplitude of sound waves, it's because it's so crucial to them to be able to do that. It's not because somebody decided that they have to have the best hearing in those kinds of conditions. Or if they're able to use sonar, for example, to construct sort of an image of their environment using sound waves, it's because they're compensating for the lack of good vision, and they still need to navigate through the environment, and because they have a good hearing system, this is what they're left with, if you will, to use, and that's what gives them this advantage over other organisms in those conditions to have a better chance of survival, and also to have a better chance of passing those genes on to the next generation through sexual selection. All right, so what is then cognitive psychology? I spent a good deal of time last time, a good hour or so, just going through a list of, defining cognitive psychology and going through a list of all the cognitive faculties that we think are important to the definition of what is human and what is not. And then we started sort of pinpointing a few of them and going through this documentary in a very gradual way to try to see what evidence there is to show us that, for example, other creatures can also problem solve, other creatures can use tools, other creatures can plan ahead of time before they carry something out, and so on and so forth, to the point that we're now ready to talk about humans as social creatures and the way in which they learn things from other members of the groups in a social context. But again, so that you're not left out of the discussion, here is the definition of cognitive psychology. It's basically the study of normal mental function and its relationship with behavior. This is the distinction we make for cognitive psychology that is, it's focused on normal function as opposed to abnormal function, which leads to clinical psychology and so on. So, again, people who study this attempt to explain the comprehension of sensory information, how attention is modulated, how memories are formed, how speech is produced, how problems are solved, how mental imagery is formed and manipulated, and so on and so forth. And in the cycle of sort of cognitive life, cognitive functions have a very particular place. This is a very simple, straightforward diagram of how the mind sort of interacts. This is based on, again, our current understanding of how the mind operates. So this tells us how the mind deals with incoming information from the environment and how it uses that information to then instruct the body to act appropriately towards those objects or events that created the information in the first place, or mediated the information to the mind. So everything, as you can imagine, starts with the environment as far as processing of information is concerned. So at one point, there has to have been a stimulus that interacts with our sensory organs through the process of attention. There are tons of things out there that we are completely unaware of. We pay attention to things that are meaningful to us, we want to process further, and so on. And what that does is that it facilitates the interaction of the energies coming from that source, such as the screen, or the light coming from the screen, and your eyes, which are looking at it. So your attention makes this, or allows this interaction to happen. Stimulus goes on the receptors. Its form of energy changes from whatever it is, electromagnetic energy, acoustic pressures, or acoustic energy for sound waves, tactile pressure, and so on and so forth, to a singular form, which is the bioelectrical sort of energy, if you will, that neurons are able to transmit to one another and process and so on. Processing takes place, then the moment of awareness takes place, where you are aware of seeing or hearing or feeling something, and then only after that one is able to categorize that experience as something new or something that has happened before. So that's when recognition takes place. And recognition, being part of the larger sort of context of cognitive faculties, is that step where cognition sort of interfaces with the rest of mental processing. And as I said, this, for example, this act of recognition allows you to make an appropriate decision as to what you want to do with that information. Let's say you're a butterfly collector. You're walking down the Montreal Park and you see some pattern on the tree that you think is a butterfly. Right? You think it's a butterfly. It's a similar pattern to something you've seen. That moment where you have recognized this pattern is the moment that you can make a decision, whether you want to approach it or you want to continue going wherever you are going. And that is how your actions are then determined by the kinds of things that have been inputted into the system and interfaced or interacted with your knowledge of what the world is or was some time ago. We talked about a little bit about the methods that are used in cognitive psychology, and again, we emphasize the fact that a great deal of attention is paid to the implementation of experimental controls, so we can tease out very specific aspects of cognitive processing in a very stepwise, very tedious, very time-consuming fashion. So we manipulate one factor at a time, and that gives rise to the sort of emergence of an idea about what, let's say, this part of the visual system does compared to that part, and so on and so forth. And we are always cognizant of the fact that we can't see mental events themselves. This is not in a sense a hard science where your subject matter is something tangible, you can measure its weight and volume and density and so on and so forth. You can say that about the brain as an anatomist, but not about the mind as a psychologist. So we have to resort to sort of evidence, just like a good investigator, inspector, follows the trail of evidence to draw conclusions about what must have happened at this time and that time and so on. This is essentially what a cognitive psychologist does. The subject matter is always elusive, and we can only get close to it by forming appropriate theories and hypotheses and then going about and testing. So ultimately, we're always drawing inferences about the nature of underlying mental events from the observed experimental data. So in the process of discussing what is uniquely human and what is not, we went through, as I said earlier, a number of segments of this documentary, looking at whether or not, let's say, we know humans have self-awareness, they can recognize themselves in a mirror, they can do this as early as about maybe 8-9 months of age, and so on and so forth. But it would be pretty awesome to see, let's say, an orangutan or a chimpanzee do the same thing. And we saw evidence that even those creatures at very young ages can recognize themselves. Now, the way to do this, without really sort of rewinding everything back to the beginning, the way to do this is a very clever way called the mirror test, whereby without instructing even children who are going through this test what they're going to do, you very rapidly put a bit of paint on some part of their body, like their face. Right? And as they're going about doing their play and so on, somehow at some point they encounter a mirror, they look at their reflection, and the sort of natural tendency for someone who has a stain on their face is to go and rub it out when they see their reflection. And that simple act is indicative of having the mental faculty of recognizing oneself, knowing exactly where to reach based on the mirror image on the face and where the actual stain has occurred. And believe it or not, again, the documentary shows that great apes, orangutans, chimpanzees, and gorillas have been tested with this test in this paradigm, and they all show the presence of this mental faculty. They can recognize themselves in a mirror. And since that discovery, it's been banned to conduct any invasive scientific experimentation on these species of great apes. So for now, over 50 years or so, they are considered as, if you will, as self-conscious as you and I are. They know themselves, they know that they're being subjected to painful situations in the context of scientific experimentation. And again, it's been a number of decades that we can't, or scientists can't touch them in those specific ways. So, and the story grows more and more interesting, and we see that various kinds of things that we thought were only human, that were in the domain of human cognitive function, seem to also be shared with these other creatures. Now, what I want to draw your attention to is this very unique human quality that we are all familiar with, something we've all gone through, and that is social learning. From the moment we're born, we're exposed to all sorts of behaviors, ranging from speech production to simple routines of washing your hands and tying your shoelaces, and even in some cultures, as you can imagine, a lot of cultural habits are learned through just observation, from just seeing what other people do and imitating those behaviors. So in that sense, we are so sorry.
یه مثل استادی تحقیقی همونجا الکتروفیزیولوژیکال میشه منظور چیه؟
الکتروفیزیولوژیکال emergence. بله، منظور اینجا اینه که ما میتونیم به نه تنها به بیهیویر توجه بکنیم، از طریق بیهیویر بفهمیم که چه اتفاقی توی مایند داره میفته، توی ذهن داره میفته، بلکه میتونیم از متدهای خیلی دایرکت هری هم استفاده بکنیم، مستقیما فعالیت مغز رو یا سلول‌های مغزی رو اندازه بدیم و با بالا پایین شدن اون فعالیت رو میتونیم پی ببریم که کدوم قسمت مغز ما داره چه فعالیتی انجام میده و چجوری فعالیت مغزی قادرن رو بالا پایین
بعد همون چیزی که الان باشه
بله، تا یه حدی مثلا متد خیلی متداولی که الان هست متد برین ایمیجینگ، نیورو ایمیجینگ و مردم کلشون میکنن توی اسکنری و ازشون میخوان یه سری کارهایی رو انجام بدن، مثلا چند تا کلمه رو تکرار میکنن یا چه میدونم یک چیزی رو از ذهن از حافظه‌شون بیرون بیارن و طی انجام این کار دارن هم دائما از مغز اینها در واقع فیلم برداری میکنن و با دونستنی که این طرف داره چه کار میکنه و دریافت این ویدیوهایی که از مغز دارن میتونن میشه در واقع نتیجه گیری کرد که اون فعالیت مغزی که مربوط به اون کار هست داره کجا اتفاق میفته و چجوری بالا پایین میشه. نه، صحبت برین ایمیجینگ داریم میکنیم. بله، EEG و MEG هم هست، بعد حتی متدهای خیلی دایرکتری هم هست که ما حتی یه دونه سلول رو میتونیم یا چند تا سلول مغزی رو میتونیم آیسولیت بکنیم. جناب؟ درست، بله.
من این سوال داشتم راجع به سایکولوژی. ببین من مثلا در حالی که با شما دارم انسان‌ها در رابطه‌شون با دیگران از لایه‌های مختلف رفتاری استفاده می‌کنن. شاید من از شما از رابطه مثلا از لول 4 استفاده کنم با یه لول 2 استفاده بکنم. اینو توی این قسمت چجوری میشه توجیهش کرد؟ بعد مثلا کسایی که حالا با شاید مثلا حالا روی روان دارن، بعضی از دکترها مثلا بهشون دارو میدن برای تعادل شیمیایی بدنشون. این قسمت ریسپتور جا میشه، اون سایکلی کشیده بودی. این ریسپتوره چه چیزی
نه، وقتی اون ریسپتوری که من صحبتشو میکنم در واقع اینا سلول‌های خیلی اسپشیالایزدی هستن که مثلا قشر چی میگن؟ شبکیه، درست میگم؟ رتینا این قشر حساس پشت چشم هست. این علت این که میشه یعنی دیدن در واقع اتفاق میفته به خاطر وجود یه سری سلول‌های خیلی اسپشیالایزدی اونجا که انرژی نور رو تبدیل به انرژی بیوالکتریک میکنن. اونا رو میگیم ریسپتور. ولی ریسپتور یه بخشی که در رابطه با پیام رسانی بین سلول‌های عصبی هم استفاده میشه. اون وقت صحبت یه سری پروتئین‌ها رو داریم میکنیم که یه سری کمیکال‌های رو دریافت میکنن، یه سری فرآیندهای بیوشیمی اتفاق میفته و صحبت میشه.
از این چیزی که مثلا روانشناس مثلا بیوشیمی
آره، اون ریسپتورهایی که تحت در واقع یکی که تحت درمان هست باهاش کار دارن، اون ریسپتورهای پروتئینی هستن که ارتباط بین سلول‌ها رو تنظیم میکنن و یه جای مغز ممکنه فعالیتش کم باشه، یکی رو دچار دیپرشن بکنه، یه جای مغز ممکنه فعالیتش زیاد باشه، یکی رو دچار اسکیزوفرنیا بکنه و با استفاده از این محلول‌های شیمیایی متفاوت که هزار جورش هست میتونن سعی کنن اینا رو یه تعادلی برسونن.
لایه‌های مختلف رفتاری؟
لایه‌های مختلف رفتاری، والا من اینو درست متوجه نمیشم منظورتون چیه. اگر این ذره بهتون بیشتر توضیح بدید.
الان یه اتفاقی اینجا بیفته، شاید من الان در این مکان در این لحظه یه رفتاری نشون بدم، ولی اگر این اتفاق شد 10 تا بیفته یه رفتار دیگه از خودم.
اینو ما میگیم مثلا کانتکست دیپندنت بیهیویر. به کانتکستش ربط داره، به این شرایطی که الان. خب اینم باز به لحاظ اینه که شما یک آگاهی از محیط خودتون دارید، یک قدرت تشخیصی دارید که الان اینجا باید چه اتفاقی بیفته و چجوری رفتار بکنید، در اون شرایط دیگه چجوری باید رفتار بکنید. اینا باید برمیگرده به همون قضیه که یک سیستم حافظه‌ای ما داریم که داده‌هایی رو به صورت آگاه یا ناخودآگاه conscious or unconscious اینا رو همه جمع کرده و توی اون قسمتی که اینجا کشیدیم میاد و یه جوری با اطلاعاتی داره وارد سیستم دائما میشه. اینا دائما در حال تداخل که به شما این قدرت تشخیص رو بدن که الان باید چیکار کنن، توی این شرایط باید چیکار کنن، توی شرایط دیگه. اوکی، حالا باز صحبت سر اینه که این قضیه سوشال لرنینگ از اگه بخوایم یه ذره بیشتر تعریفش بکنیم چی میتونیم راجعش بگیم؟ So we see people do things, we repeat them, as simple as that. And learning takes, amongst other ways of learning, this is one of the most predominant forms of transmitting information from one generation to the next, so that it doesn't take millions of years of evolution to achieve the same thing. So it's been a tremendous, as you can imagine, a tremendous achievement in the development or in the evolution of the brain to have some kind of a mechanism that allows for information to be transmitted and to be incorporated into the behavior of an individual like this. So readily, so effortlessly that we don't even have to think about it. We see and we do. But if you think about what has to go on from the moment you see something, and the moment that you repeat that action or that set of actions, you see that it's a huge problem that has to be solved, and that the fact that it's taking place so readily is an indication of what a tremendous achievement it is. So let me just set the stage a little bit better. Then we take a look at a presentation by one of the most prominent neuroscientists alive today. He's been referred by many as the Paul Brokaw of the 21st century. And he has a very particular insight into this. But I just preface that with the next couple of points. One is something we all know. Vision is the predominant sense for humans and other primates. We are seeing creatures more than anything else, right? This is just by referring back to your own experiences and so on. You look at the way the brain is structured, almost 70 to 80% of the cortical surface of the brain receives visual information in one form or another. And that's further proof that vision has a huge role to play in just about everything we do. We know, again, based on what I've said and based on your reference to your own memory and everything you've seen around you, we are good at just imitating other people. We look at them, we see what they're doing, and we are able to carry those actions out. Whether they're silly actions or very profound, skillful actions, again, seeing seems to be the key in being able to master such complex or silly behaviors. So, observational learning, which is, if you will, a subcategory of social learning, we could also socially learn through other means, through hearing, through smelling, and so on, but mainly through seeing, is the primary mode of transferring skills, particularly to developing infants. And by extension, we see that even apes, chimpanzees, orangutans, and gorillas, seem to engage in these kinds of observational behaviors to learn from the older members of their social groups. So, what has been a very profound finding, discovery in the past maybe 15, 20 years, is the discovery of what is now referred to as a mirror system in the brain. A system that allows us to reflect the actions of others in a very effortless way in our own minds. So not only we can understand what they're doing, but then we can incorporate those actions into our own repertoire and essentially learn through seeing, just by observation. A group of physiologists led by this fellow, the older one in the middle, called Giacomo Rizzolatti, from the University of Parma in Italy, were the first people who discovered the system. They were engaged in studying complex motor commands that are sent from this part of the brain called the premotor area to various muscle groups for reaching out and grabbing a piece of food and bringing it to your mouth. It's a simple thing, the simplest thing that we learn from childhood, right? Grab something, put it in your mouth. To the point that we have to keep telling children, don't put this in your mouth, don't put that in your mouth, until they learn what can go in the mouth and what can't. Right? I'm a father of two young kids, and I know what a terrible lesson that is to teach. So this very simple behavior involves the coordination of activity across this massive swath of cortex. First, visual information has to be taken in at the back of the brain. Then one segment of it, which deals with what it is you're looking at, has to be analyzed here, down here. Another segment of it, which has to do with where the object is in space and how it's moving and so on and so forth, is dealt with by this part of the brain. Those two have to somehow be bound together so you know what you're looking at. Then this part of the brain sends commands to here, to an area called the planning area, if you will, for the lack of a better term. That's before you even produce an action, you have to have a plan for what you want to do. You have to know, for example, if I want to reach out and grab this mouse, I have to know where exactly this thing is in my external space. So I don't go like this, or I don't go here, or I don't go to the left or right of it, that I reach it every time I want to reach it. Right? So not only do I need to know where that is, I need to have an idea of how far my arm has to go, how fast it has to be thrown out into space, and where I have to start decelerating, and so on. So imagine all these things that I'm telling you, which are just a fraction of sort of the number of steps you have to take, or your brain has to take, your mind has to take, to achieve this simplest of tasks. Reach out and grab something when you want it. Now, also pay attention to how I'm reaching. Before I even reach the object, my hand is taking the shape of the object. I'm not going like this. I'm not going like this. Right? I'm going about the object the way it's structured. So that tells me that this part of my brain, which analyzes the shape of the object, is also feeding into my plans so that I know. To maximize my efficiency, I have to start taking the shape of the object in my hand to better grasp it. Right? Now, all of those steps are taking place in an matter of a fraction of a second, before this part of the brain, a couple of neurons, literally 1 or 2 neurons in that part of the brain, are sending motor commands to the arm to go out this far and to grasp this object. And once you achieve that, those motor neurons go silent.
این سوالی که برام شما که این پروسه هستگی اتفاق میفته.
هر بار
یه حافظه‌ای داریم و یه بار این پروسه رو مثلا مغز ما انجام میده و
نه، هر بار که شما میخواید، چون کانشسلی این اتفاق میفته، چون تصمیم میگیرید که این کار رو بکنید، باید حتما از کورتکس این برخیز نمی‌پردازه بشه و هر بار هم همون اتفاق داره میفته. حالا اگه وقت بشه یه سری ویدیو هم راجع به این دارم بهتون نشون میدم. But essentially, these guys are interested in characterizing these very complex neurons that receive this sort of multitude of messages and orchestrate a massive set of contractions and relaxations throughout the course of time, so you can do this. Grab this and, I'm not going to put that in my mouth, but let's say it's a piece of fruit or something, I would then reach out and then bring it back to my mouth. As they were doing this, they were recording from neurons, individual neurons in that part of the monkey's brain. So the monkey's reaching out, grasping a piece of food, bringing it back to its mouth. And those bars that you see down there, those show the level of activity in one of those neurons. Accidentally, as they were recording, one of those 5 people, the one to the bottom left, he reaches out and grabs a piece of the fruit because he had put 2 pieces instead of 1. And as he's reaching out to grab the piece of fruit, this neuron, which was supposed to command the arm to move, the arm of the monkey to move, starts firing almost the same way as though the monkey is doing the task. Right? So not only that neuron is initiating and orchestrating commands for movement, but also it's able to understand what somebody else is doing because it's active during the same set of behaviors. But not so much when you try to reach and grab the object with a piece of pliers, which is, to the monkey, is completely irrelevant, really nonsensical. It doesn't even know possibly what that thing is, even though it has the shape of 2 fingers or two sort of digits that would grasp something. It's an unfamiliar action, right? So this was the beginning of again, a massive amount of work that has gone into this field to try to understand what these neurons or what this system is doing. And what we think they're doing is that they're giving us a mechanism for mediating social learning. We look, we see, and we incorporate those actions, we learn, and we move on. And as a result, some people like our fellow here, Shahin, who still teaches at the University of San Diego, University of California in San Diego, believes that this is the fabric that, if you will, the fabric that has allowed for culture to emerge in the human societies. The foundation upon which culture has been built. Because what is culture? It's a set of rituals and behaviors that are specific to a group of people, which is transmitted essentially by nonverbal, imitative sort of strategies. We look, we see, we learn, we do. And we become a member of that society, but how closely we are able to carry out those sets of behaviors. So I'm just going to step out of here for a minute, show you this little video. Now that the image is also good. He's got a bit of a thick Indian accent, but I'm sure you can understand it.
Just think about this problem for a second. Here's a lump of flesh about 3 pounds that you can hold in the palm of your hand. But if you can contemplate the vastness of interstellar space, you can contemplate the meaning of infinity, ask questions about the meaning of its own existence, about the nature of God. And this is truly the most amazing thing in the world. It's the greatest mystery confronting human beings. How does it all come about? Well, the brain, as you know, is made up of neurons. Looking at neurons here, there are 100 billion neurons in the adult human brain. And each neuron makes something like 1,000 to 10,000 contacts with other neurons in the brain. And based on this, people have calculated that the number of permutations and combinations of brain activity exceeds the number of elementary particles in the universe. So how do you go about studying the brain? One approach is to look at patients who had lesions in different parts of the brain and study changes in their behavior. And this is what I spoke about in the last chat. Today I'll talk about a different approach, which is to put electrodes in different parts of the brain and actually record the activity of individual nerve cells in the brain. And sort of eavesdrop on the activity of nerve cells in the brain. Now, one recent discovery that has been made by researchers in Italy, in Parma, like Giacomo Rizzolatti and his colleagues, is a group of neurons called mirror neurons, which are in the front of the brain, in the frontal lobes. Now, it turns out that the neurons, which are called ordinary motor command neurons in the front of the brain, which have been known for over 50 years, these neurons will fire when a person performs a specific action. For example, if I do that and reach and grab an apple, the motor command neuron in the front of my brain will fire. If I reach out and pull an object, another neuron will fire, commanding me to pull my pulled object. These are called motor command neurons that have been known for a long time. But what Rizzolatti found was a subset of these neurons, maybe about 20% of them, will also fire when I'm looking at somebody else performing the same action. So here's a neuron that fires when I reach and grab something, but it also fires when I watch Joe reaching and grabbing something. And this is truly astonishing. This is as though this neuron is adopting the other person's point of view. And it's almost as performing a virtual reality simulation of the other person's action. Now, what is the significance of these mirror neurons? For one thing, they must be involved in things like imitation and emulation. Because to imitate a complex act, it requires my brain to adopt the other person's point of view. So this is important for imitation and emulation. Well, why is that important? Well, let's take a look at the next slide. So, how do you do imitation? Why is imitation important? Mirror neurons and imitation and emulation. Now, let's look at culture, the phenomenon of human culture. If you go back in time about 7,500 years ago, let's look at human evolution. It turns out that something very important happened around 7,500 years ago. And that is a sudden emergence and rapid spread of a number of skills that are unique to human beings, like tool use, the use of fire, the use of shelters, and of course language, and the ability to read somebody else's mind and interpret that person's behavior. All of that happened relatively quickly. Even though the human brain had achieved its present size almost 300,000 or 400,000 years ago, 100,000 years ago, all of this happened very, very quickly. And I claim that what happened was the sudden emergence of a sophisticated neural system, which allowed you to emulate and imitate other people's actions. So that when there was a sudden accidental discovery by one member of the group, say use of fire or a particular type of tool, instead of dying out, it spread rapidly horizontally across the population, or was transmitted vertically down the generations. So this made evolution suddenly Lamarckian instead of Darwinian. In Darwinian evolution is slow, it takes hundreds of thousands of years. Polar bear evolve a code will take thousands of generations, maybe 100,000 years. A human being, a child, will just watch its parent kill another polar bear and skin it and put the skin on its body, fur on the body, and learn it in one step. What the polar bear took 100,000 years to learn, it can learn in 5 minutes, maybe 10 minutes, right? And then once it's learned this, it spreads by geometric proportion across the population. This is the basis of imitation complex skills, and what we call culture is the basis of civilization. Now there's another kind of mirror neuron, which is involved in something quite different, and that is there are mirror neurons, there are mirror neurons for action, there are mirror neurons for touch. In other words, if somebody touches me in my hand, neuron in the somatosensory cortex and the sensory region of the brain fires. But the same neuron, in some cases, will fire when I simply watch another person being touched. So most of them will fire when I'm touched in different locations, different neurons for different locations. But a subset of them will fire even when I watch somebody else being touched in the same location. So here again you have neurons that involve in empathy. Now the question then arises, if I simply watch another person being touched, why do I not get confused and literally feel that touch sensation merely by watching somebody being touched? And I empathize with that person, but I don't literally feel the touch. Well, that's because you've got receptors in your skin, touch and pain receptors, going back into your brain and saying, don't worry, you're not being touched. So empathize by all means with the other person, but do not actually experience the touch, otherwise you get confused and muddled. Okay, so there's a feedback signal that vetoes the signal of the mirror neuron, preventing you from consciously experiencing that touch. But if you remove the arm, you simply anesthetize my arm. So you put the injection in my arm, anesthetize the brachial plexus, so the arm is numb and no sensations coming in. If I now want you being touched, I literally feel it in my hand. In other words, you've dissolved the barrier between you and other human beings. So I call them Gandhi neurons, or empathy neurons. And this is not in some abstract metaphorical sense. All that's separating you from him, from the other person, is your skin. Remove the skin, you experience that person's touch in your mind. You dissolve the barrier between you and other human beings. And this, of course, is based on much of Eastern philosophy, and that is there's no real independent self aloof from other human beings, inspecting the world and inspecting other people. You're in fact connected not just via Facebook and internet, you're actually quite literally connected by your neurons. There's whole chains of neurons around this room talking to each other. And there is no real distinctiveness from your consciousness from somebody else's consciousness. And this is not numbers in the philosophy, it emerges from an understanding of basic neuroscience. If you have a patient with a phantom limb, the arm has been removed, and you have a phantom, you watch somebody else being touched, you feel it in your phantom. Now the astonishing thing is, if you have pain in your phantom limb, you squeeze the other person's hand, massage the other person's hand, that relieves the pain in your phantom hand. Almost as though the neuron were obtaining relief from merely watching somebody else being massaged. So here you have my last slide. For the longest time, people regarded science and humanities as being distinct. C.P. Snow spoke of the two cultures, science on the one hand, humanities on the other. Never the twain shall meet. So I'm saying the mirror neuron system lies in the interface, allowing you to think about issues like consciousness, representation of self, what separates you from other human beings, what allows you to empathize with other human beings, and also even things like the emergence of culture and civilization, which is unique to human beings. Thank you.
All right, questions? He talks fast and it's for a neuroscientist, this stuff is mind-boggling. That we have in us this system that can do so much, and that we barely scratched the surface in the past 150 years or so in trying to understand what it does and what it's capable of doing. And then there are still major discoveries like this being made. But back to what we're talking about, before we see the next segment of the actual documentary, this was supposed to be a way of sort of introducing you to the concept of the brain mechanism that allows for social learning to happen. This mirror system that is so readily available to all sensory.
این برام خیلی جالب بود. اگر دست رو بی‌حس کنیم و نگاه کنیم یه نفری داره چیز می‌کنه دست ببینیم اینو حس می‌کنیم درست؟ اینو با تو متوجه شدم؟ نگاه خودت داری اون تجربه رو
نه تنها ببینید آره اولش اینه که وقتی که من مثلا فکر کنید الان یک چیز تیزی رو بردارم اینجا شروع کنم فرو کردن تو دست یا نزدیک بکنم شما یواش یواش اگر که بتونیم با همون تکنیک‌های نوروایمجینگ و اینا به مغزتون نگاه بکنید اون قسمت مغز که در واقع این دست شما رو داره کنترل میکنه یا حس دست رو میگیره اونجا شروع میکنه اکتیو شدن با اینکه به دست شما اصلا ربطی نداره درسته؟ این قسمت میرورشه یعنی شما حس میکنید یا قادرید درک بکنید که اون ممکنه چه دردی الان بکشه یا چه احساسی رو بکنه ولی صحبتش اینه که علت این که شما کانفیوز نیستین که این اتفاق داره واسه خودتون میفته یا واسه دیگری اینه که از اینجا هیچ پیامی به مغزتون نمیرسه یا پیامی که داره میرسه اینه که به قول معروف یا ساینتیست‌ها یه نگاتیو فیدبک سیگناله که داره به اون میرور سیستم میگه که این دست تو نیست این دست دیگری داره اتفاق واسش یعنی اینترپریتیشنش اینه وقتی اون سیگنال میرسه حالا میگه اگه ما این دست رو بی‌حسش بکنیم بعد شما دست دیگری رو نگاه بکنید که بلایی داره دستش سرش میاد احساس میکنید سر خودتون داره میاد چون اون میرر سیستم دیگه اون سیگنال رو نمیگیره، اون در واقع اووررایدینگ سیگنال رو دریافت نمیکنه و صحبتش اینه که اون چه که در واقع مایند ماها رو از هم جدا میکنه، کانشسنس ما رو از هم جدا میکنه، همین وجود بدن همونه. منطقه ببینید با یه تعریف خیلی علمی رسیده به یه صحبت چند هزار ساله بودا و کریشنا. حالا برصورت اون بک‌گراندش این حرف هست و تونسته از این توی این زمین ها بگذارنش. ولی اون چه که من فکر کنم هنوز خیلی جالبه برای صحبت ما اینه که الان یه سریع یک تمایزی حاصل بشیم، قائل بشیم برای what is action learning, what is the counterpart of action learning. So the way observational learning could occur, according to people who study this for a living, could be in two ways. Either we meticulously follow the steps that a demonstrator, let's say a master, if you will, in the context of master-disciple relationship, is carrying out. So you observe exactly what they're doing. Imagine martial arts. They tell you you need to, I don't know, kick something, or throw a punch in a certain way. You keep looking at it, and you try to imitate until you sort of align yourself with what is being shown. So that's called imitation, and it's a very simple way of understanding how observational learning can happen. But there's also another way. You can learn something that's based on the result obtained from that action, which we call result learning or result-based learning, or ultimately emulation. You're not interested in what steps are taken to get from point A to point D or C. You might find a shortcut. You might find, I don't know, a different way of doing it. If your goal is to get across the river, maybe you can swim it as opposed to going across the bridge, which most people do. So you don't imitate, you emulate. You get across using a different strategy, using a different method, and so on and so forth. But you still get to the same, you get the same thing done. If the goal of the action is achieving something, you've achieved it. You've brought across the river, done the same thing, using a different strategy. So these are the two ways in which observational learning can occur. One doesn't really involve a lot of thinking. It's just observation and methodological repetition of what is being shown. The other one requires you to analyze what is being achieved and what could be done in order to maybe find fewer steps or a different route to the same result. So for a long time, lower primates were thought to be the imitation learners. Hence the old saying of monkey see, monkey do. However, and that's where the documentary comes to help us understand if there is a distinction anymore or not. Are humans learning things the same way as monkeys do or not? And because we have a little bit of time, I just want to rewind this tape a little bit to where we sort of ended it last time, maybe a little bit earlier than where we ended it last time. So you can see the context in which this problem is being presented. Okay, so here we have a design to see whether or not humans and apes are similar to each other or are using different strategies or in essence are different from one another. And this one is called Tuli. عملا شباهت‌ها توجه کردیم یا چیزایی که پیدا کردیم در رابطه با توانایی‌های ایپ‌ها نسبت به انسان‌ها تقریباً تفاوت با هم نداشتن. ولی از اینجا باید یواش یواش شروع کنیم تفاوت اساسی رو کشف کردن یا بهش برخورد کردن و این به نظر من یکی از اساسی‌ترین تفاوت‌هاست که نحوه یادگیری اصلا کاملا سایت یادگیری فرق می‌کنه. اصلا به نظر من هیچ دست و پای این قدم هایی که باید بردارن به مقصد برسن دست و پایی داریم. اون میگه که راحت ترین یا کوتاه‌ترین راه سریع پیدا میکنن و حالا فراز یا حالا هر چیز دیگه هست سریع بهش دست پیدا میکنن. و با توجه به اینکه راه به نظر عاقلانه ترین میاد ولی خب در این حال شاید همین که ما اینقدر مبادله تبلیغ هستیم و اینها باعث به وجود آمدن خیلی ساختاری بزنیم کارشایی یا فرهنگ یا هرچی که توش هست که راحت دست روشن هست ریلیژن هست نظرات مذهبی تبلیغ و غیر مصادره شاید به خاطر همین چاپ برای زندگی بیشتر از زندگی نمی‌ناست و خیلی باعث توسعه ما در زمینه شده. و در صورت این خیلی خیلی بیشتر از هم میشه احتمالاً توضیح داد ولی اون صحبتی که از اول کردیم که بازم فکر می‌کنم چون نمودید براتون شاید تازگی داشته باشه این قضیه‌ای که 98% ژنتیک ما در واقع یکیه با چمپانزی ها و علت من که شکران شدن واسه همینه به قول معروف تابع علامت ماهیت خودم باشم ولی تو همون 1.6% یا 2% که تفاوت هست به نظر میاد که یواش یواش داریم اثر اون تفاوت رو در زمینه رفتاری و فکری و برخورد با این حرفا پیدا می‌کنیم. و آنها اشاره بودید در پایگاه یک دو دفعه بعد بیشتر تفاوت‌های اساسی ها یاد بگیریم. خیلی ممنون از توجهتون. اگر سوالی دارید در